Well, guys, welcome to my 200th review on YouTube. I know, this has been crazy. I mean, I've only been in my second year on YouTube, and I'm already on my 200th review overall. And I just had my 100th review at the beginning of this year. And in that video, I talked about one of my favorite movies of all time, Inception. And so I'm going to do much the same here and talk about one of my favorite movies of all time. And I thought long and hard about this, about what I was going to talk about, because there's many movies that are my favorite movies of all time that I could talk about. But then at the end of the day, there was only one that I knew I had to talk about, and that is my favorite movie of all time, Alexander. Yeah, that Alexander. Yes, guys, I mean it when I say my favorite movie of all time actually is Oliver Stone's Alexander from 2004, starring Colin Farrell, Val Kilmer, Jared Leto, Rosario Dawson, Anthony Hopkins, and Angelina Jolie. I absolutely love this movie, guys, and I know that is not a popular opinion because this movie, when it was released in 2004, was absolutely trashed and still to this day is not looked fondly upon, being considered a complete failure upon its release, getting a 16% on Rotten Tomatoes. I think that's what it has right now. Yeah, and audiences didn't like this film, critics didn't like this film, but I can say that I have found those odd people out there that do actually really like this film, and thank you guys for liking this film, but I understand completely if other people do not, because this is a tough film to sell. It's a very long film and it has everything in it that I love about filmmaking in general. And also, something I love about this film is the passion that is behind it. This movie came out kind of at the perfect time period because we were getting movies such as Gladiator and Troy, The Last Samurai, and Kingdom of Heaven. It came out around that time period when we were getting a kind of renaissance of epic cinema because this is kind of a callback to the 1950s and 1960s with movies such as Lawrence of Arabia, The Ten Commandments, and Ben-Hur. It was a return to that style of filmmaking just in the modern age. And this is a time period in film that I am absolutely fascinated by. And also, if you guys know me at all, my favorite genre out of any genre is epic cinema. And so, I mean, I'm gonna like this film no matter what. But I, as I said, I love this film, and it's not just because I think it's underrated or anything, which I think it is underrated to some degree. But as I said, I love the passion behind this film and what Oliver Stone took to make this film work and the steps he made. And it's definitely a labor of love. And when you watch this film, and especially watch the commentary tracks, you know that he loved this story. He loved Alexander and he wanted to tell that story. This is a story that he's been wanting to tell for decades, originally going to make it in the 80s and 90s and not getting to make it until 2004. Originally, it was going to star Val Kilmer as Alexander, but things didn't work out. But he finally got it worked out, and I'm glad that he finally got to make the movie he had always been wanting to make, because Oliver Stone has said in the past that Alexander the Great is a personal hero of him, and to see a director being able to portray his hero on this big screen is amazing. That is fantastic. And I think he needs to be commended for it because not all this movie is bad. And I'm not going to defend the movie for those that hate it and everything, but I think there's a lot in this film that is very good in many different ways. And also, I'm a big history buff, guys. I mean, anybody that knows me knows I love history. I mean, that's what I'm going to school for currently. I love this time period as well. I love the story of Alexander the Great. In fact, let me just show you. See that? Yeah. All these books on Alexander the Great. I'm kind of I'm kind of obsessed a little bit. I know lot a lot about Alexander, and I've read his story multiple times with these different sources, and I just love learning about his story. And this movie, I really have to thank for introducing me to Alexander and the grand scale of it all, because without this film, I don't know if I would have been as interested in Alexander the Great as I was. Now, before we get really started into talking about the movie, I've given you some context behind all this stuff, some little bits and pieces of information, but I really want to talk about this on a personal level, because I think that's what will sell this review for some of you guys that are not for me when in terms of this movie, because I know this is not a popular opinion. People do not say that Alexander is their favorite movie of all time. I understand that, but I do have my reasons. And my story of Alexander and how I came across this film begins in about 2006 when I got the Alexander director's cut, which is the second cut of the movie that was made. My dad and I watched it, and at that time in my life, it didn't have an impact on me, really. I mean, I watched it, and I did find it kind of boring at this time. It wasn't a film that, I gravitated towards or, wanted to watch again, but it always stuck with me, too. That there was always images in my head that I remember from the film. And I didn't watch it for several years. And then one night in it must have been ninth or 10th grade. So this is going on 10 or 9 years ago. I couldn't sleep. I was in my room. I couldn't sleep. And I was like, well, I'll put on a movie. So what movie should I watch? And I was like, well, I'll put on Alexander, the director's cut. And I watched that movie, and I fell in love with it. Guys, it was just that simple. There was something about it. Maybe it was just me being very loopy at 2 in the morning watching a 3-hour movie, but I just loved every second of it. And after it was over, I wanted to watch it again. In fact, Alexander ended up being the movie I was watching the most all the time. I would watch it several times a day, one after the other. That's how much I consumed this movie, and it became a personal favorite of mine until I realized that maybe Inception wasn't my favorite movie of all time. Maybe it is this. And so that's when I adopted it as my favorite movie of all time, and it got me into studying Alexander and really got me into history, especially during my high school years. And of course, I still remember when I got the final cut of this movie, because if you guys don't know, there are 4 cuts of this movie: the theatrical cut, the director's cut, the final cut, and then the ultimate cut. And I only owned the director's cut. In fact, I hadn't even seen the theatrical cut at the time. But my 9th grade history teacher, he was a really nice guy. He was one of my favorite teachers I've ever had. And I remember my senior year of high school, as a graduation present, he gave me his copy of Alexander Revisited, the final cut, and to this day, that is one of the best presents anybody has ever given me. And I went home and watched that movie and watched it again and loved it because this movie that I had been watching, Alexander the Director's Cut, was something I loved, but with the final cut, it was just more of it because it was a 3.5 hour movie with an intermission. It was in the style of those epics that I love as a kid, such as Ben-Hur and Ten Commandments, and it was just really exciting for me and really just fun getting to watch this film in a new light with new scenes and all this stuff, and then the ultimate cut comes out and all this stuff. And yes, guys, I love this movie, and I think it's extremely underrated. It's not a perfect film, and that's coming from someone that says this is his favorite movie of all time. There are a lot of problems with the film, but I think a lot of my love for this film comes from not only the stuff it does in the film and the stuff that I like in films is in this film, but the fact that it was such a big passion project for Oliver Stone, and seeing that fully realized is fantastic. So anyway, guys, that's all I got for, the backstory of this film. So really, let's get into this film in general. So Alexander, of course, tells the story of Alexander the Great and how he conquered the world, and his greater importance in the grand scheme of things. And something I love about this film is, well, many things, of course, but I love the star-studded cast of this film, reminding me of the old epics. When you had people like Charlton Heston or Peter O'Toole in these types of films, this is a fantastic cast of people like Colin Farrell, Jared Leto, Val Kilmer, Anthony Hopkins, which Anthony Hopkins in this film honestly brings one of my favorite Anthony Hopkins moments, especially near the end of this film. I love his character in this film, and I love the focus of how this film is, because if you watch the film, you'll see that it's told from the perspective of somebody that was there. Anthony Hopkins plays Old Ptolemy, who was a friend of Alexander's, and he's telling the story of Alexander from his point of view, and it's kind of like reading actual historical texts where we are seeing things from this author's point of view or this author's point of view, and some of that can be a little clouded because this movie isn't focused on telling the true story of Alexander, but it is focused on telling a side of Alexander that most people don't focus on, which is this more human side to him. And I think that's what separates this movie, especially from the 1956 film, where he is much more mythical, but this one adds some depth to him, and we see his struggles throughout this film, especially when it comes to his fighting and bickering between his mother and father and how they influence his life. And I thought that was a really interesting take. A lot of this movie has to do with the father and the mother, and they are played both wonderfully by Val Kilmer and Angelina Jolie, who do a superb job in this film. And yes, they are very over the top, and I absolutely love it. This is a movie that is meant to be over the top, because if you look at movies like The Ten Commandments, that movie is nothing but people yelling at each other, being extremely over the top, but yet people love that movie. And these characters, these actors are giving these very over-the-top monologues and speeches and saying this dialogue that should seem corny, but seems just so epic when they say it. And I think people like Val Kilmer do an excellent job of playing this very drunkard king that has a lot of depth to him and is kind of, he loves his son, but he's also very fearful of his son and what he can become, and the relationship with his mother and how rocky that is. And I think Val Kilmer plays this character beautifully, especially in several scenes with him and Alexander together on screen, such as there's this scene earlier on in the film where Val Kilmer or Philip is talking to young Alexander about being a king and what that entails as he's taking him through these caverns underneath the city of Pella and telling him about the myths. And I also love the confrontation between him and Alexander on the night of his wedding. That is such a wonderful scene, and Colin Farrell gives such a great performance in this scene, being a very vulnerable person, and I think that is beautifully done. And a lot of people talk about Colin Farrell in this film, about how his acting is absolutely horrible, and I think that is completely false. I love his acting in this film, and I think that being a little over the top isn't a bad thing, and I think he gets across kind of the childlike manner that Alexander is kind of all about. He is a man, he is a grown adult, but yet he also has this childlike quality to him. He is also a very angry person. A lot of this movie is Alexander yelling at his men, and it really delves into this side of Alexander that we don't really talk about, and that is the fact that he was a man with a temper, and I think this movie perfectly portrays that. And then we also see the influence of his mother, played wonderfully by Angelina Jolie, who gives such a fun performance. She's got a fun little accent to her too, and she is crazy in this film. And if you guys have ever heard of or listened or read the play Medea, she is straight out of Medea, and I think that's really cool. And a lot of this film is kind of influenced by Greek tragedy, which I think is really cool, and what makes this movie stand out from a lot of the epics that were coming out around the same time, and what makes this epic kind of, it has more meat to it than a lot of the epics were coming out of this time, such as Troy and Gladiator, and I thought that was really interesting and really cool. A lot of Greek tragedies have these bombastic, insane characters that are extremely over the top and just talk in this crazy way, and that's how these characters talk in this film, and I thought that was very well done. I think that Oliver Stone did a really good job of doing his homework when it came to this film, and I also love the battle scenes in this film, even though they can lead into kind of shaky cam territory, but they are very visceral and violent and very messy as well. And I like that in a battle scene where everything is just so chaotic and it makes you feel like you are actually in that battle, and I thought that was really cool. The cinematography also is beautiful, guys. This is a great looking film, especially in HD on the Ultimate Cut, which looks absolutely fantastic. I love the use of colors in this film, especially when it comes to like the greens and the blues, and it just all looks really good, as well as the set decorations. Like, a lot of these scenes are made up of like actual sets that are beautifully decorated in just lush colors and with so much detail, and the armor, just the costuming is fantastic. Seeing as it is a costume drama, it makes perfect sense, but I think the authenticity of this film is completely on point, and Vangelis's score is really underrated. I love the music to this film. In fact, I listen to it every now and then. I think it's absolutely beautiful, heroic when it needs to be, and very sad and sympathetic when it needs to be too. It's just a very great soundtrack for this movie, and we don't get soundtracks like this much anymore that have this much color and this much depth in them. One of the only composers that has this much color and depth in their music this day and age is John Williams. Now, I could talk all day about how much I love this film and what I love about this film, but there are some things in this film that aren't completely perfect and a little problematic, and this is coming from someone that says this is his favorite movie of all time. And I will say that in terms of the accents of this film, I'm going to defend this a little bit, but also I'm going to nag on it a little bit. The accents in this film can be a little distracting, especially when, like, you hear Alexander sounding like an Irishman or other actors, because this is something that Oliver Stone intentionally did. He made actors talk in a British accent or an Irish or Scottish accent. He didn't try to make them have like fake Macedonian accents that just didn't feel natural. In fact, he's doing something here that even Martin Scorsese did in his own movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, whereas many of those characters have this like Brooklyn accent to them or this British accent to them, and that is what is happening here. It's definitely here to separate the regions of where people are living at this time. Macedonians are more Irish, Scottish, whereas the Greeks are more British and Stoic. And I think that's something that is very clever, and I think it overall works, but I can admit it can be very distracting when you see Colin Farrell giving a speech in his very thick Irish accent. But overall, not too big of a problem. But something that is kind of a negative for me in this film has to do with the characters of Alexander and Hephaestion. Now, I love Jared Leto and Colin Farrell, and I think they perform their scenes very well. There's one scene between them that is absolutely beautiful. In fact, there's several scenes between them that is very beautiful and very well acted. However, I can say that I have a problem with how they portray their relationship in this film, because what Oliver Stone was wanting to do in this film was portray Alexander as bisexual, which by all accounts, by what we know and what we can infer, Alexander was in fact bisexual, and this film tried to deal with that. And I feel like they just did it in a very clumsy way. I think Oliver Stone was too scared to fully commit to it. And I wish he wasn't that scared. I feel like if he made this movie today, with movies coming out such as Love, Simon and Call Me By Your Name, more like bigger budgeted movies that are more mainstream, that are showing gay people and bisexual people, I think that if it had come out around this time, that this would have been really resolved. This problem would have been resolved and fixed and would have worked a lot better. But really, there's just, it's very middle school like in terms of their relationship, and it doesn't feel very natural at times, and it feels like they're afraid to go all the way with Alexander's bisexuality. And like, there's no scene between Hephaestion and Alexander, which is crazy because Hephaestion was so important to Alexander in the history books, and to say that they don't even share a kiss or, have a scene together that's very intimate. But there is several scenes in this movie between Alexander and one of his helpers, one of his men, who is a kind of slave boy that they have scenes together that are a little bit more intimate, but this character of Bogost really isn't that much of a character within the grand scheme of things in this film, and instead he's more just background material, and so it doesn't feel impactful, it doesn't feel earned, really. Also, there's a problem that I have in terms of two cuts of this film, and it has to involve a battle scene that is in this film. Now, as I said, that there are four cuts of this movie that exist, and each one is very different, aside for the last two, which are very similar in a lot of ways. Mostly, the ultimate cut is just a refined version of the final cut, but there is a problem I have with the final cut and the ultimate cut, and that is placing this battle in the beginning of the film. Now, to talk about this, I have to go into a lot of the history of the different cuts of this film. So you have the theatrical cut, which is filmed in chronological order. Scenes happen in chronological order. Alexander starts as a kid, ends as an adult. But the director's cut, actually, to help with the pacing of this film, they actually took scenes from the past and the present and made the movie feel more like a seesaw, where we're getting flashbacks throughout the film that fill in some of the story. And they do this for every cut after the director's cut. But when it comes to the final cut and the ultimate cut, they put this battle in the beginning of the film to kind of show us Alexander as we know him, as this great leader with one of his greatest battles of all time. And it's a 25 minute sequence, and I just don't think it overall works, especially in the last two cuts of this film, because we are watching this movie for 25 minutes and we really don't know who Alexander is. Whereas, as somebody that loves structure in a movie, we're supposed to know who this character is very early on. But at the 25-minute mark, we still don't know who this character is, and then we go into who he was, and it feels just like a waste of time, and I feel like this scene would have been served later on in the film instead of at the very beginning of the film, where we don't even know this character, and it just doesn't work for me as well, and it's one of the problems that is apparent in the final and ultimate cut. Also, there's moments where the CGI just isn't up to par, especially with this eagle that is flying throughout a lot of the movie. The CGI for it is not that good. In fact, I would say it's terrible, and it doesn't age well when you put the movie in HD either. Overall, guys, Alexander is a movie that I absolutely love, that has its share of problems, but has things I love in movies, like over-the-top acting, cinematography that is absolutely beautiful, great big battle scenes, epic dialogue, great speeches, a all-star cast, and a historical film that's at a 3.5-hour runtime with an intermission that reminds me of the epics of old, and I just love this movie, guys. I probably didn't even do a good job of explaining why I love this film, and I'm not going to convince anybody to pick this movie up or watch it and give it a try and say that, oh, it is good, but I think there are things in this movie that people really just aren't looking at, they're just glossing over the surface of this film and not taking into account many of the finer details that make this film really special and really different from any of the other epics we were getting at this time. Now, before I do my final score for the movie, of course, you know what it's going to be, of course, but I do want to say that you might be wondering what is my favorite cut of these films and how I would rank the cuts of these films. Well, seeing as there are four cuts, here we go. I would say at the bottom we have the theatrical cut. This is overall the cut of the film that should never have been released in theaters, and it did. It's very poorly paced, and I think a lot of that is because it is in chronological order, and it's sad because I think this movie was originally supposed to just be in chronological order, but it overall doesn't work for the pacing. There's a lot of scenes that feel incomplete, and that's because, well, this movie was really cut down. And then next we have the director's cut, which is the first cut of this film that I finally saw when I was little. And overall, this is a pretty good cut. I think the pacing in the film is fixed very well, but also it does have the problem of scenes kind of feeling incomplete. Then we have the final cut, which is a fantastic cut at 3.5 hours. This is very good with great structure. It has that same structure brought over from the director's cut and into this film. But I can say that the battle scene at the beginning of the movie just doesn't work out as well. And then at the very top, we have the ultimate cut, which is more of just a refined version of the final cut. It cuts out about 10 minutes of the movie, making it about 3 hours and 20 minutes instead of 3 hours and 30 minutes. And it still has that problem at the beginning of the film, but overall, I think it is the best and solid cut of the film, and I think it's the one that people should see if they want to watch this movie. But honestly, I do like every single cut of this film, and each cut feels very different and has little bits of different dialogue here and there. I would like to see a cut of this movie that just had everything in it, that had, cut dialogue, added dialogue, and maybe there will be a fifth cut at some time, or maybe I'm just going to have to make my own cut of the film. But anyway, that's all I got to say. I'm going to give Alexander a 10 out of 10. Well, guys, I want to thank you for watching this review. I hope you enjoyed it. I probably didn't convince you to watch this movie, but maybe this informed you as to why I love this film, and maybe you can at least be happy for me. But yeah, this is my favorite movie of all time. But anyway, guys, that's all I got for you. So as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next review.